Thank you, Rick. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people who are the traditional custodians of the land that we gather today, and also the Kaurna people who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which this research was conducted. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend those respects to cultural authority present with us in the room and online today. And in doing this, renew my commitment to social justice and equity. So a brief little bit of background about me and where this sort of research sits. I am a senior research fellow across the schools of psychology and public health, largely funded and supported by an early career fellowship from the Australian Research Council. And my program of research is really about trying to understand these pathways between child protection, youth justice and adult corrections, with a real focus on trying to understand where the opportunities are for prevention across the life course. I'd like to acknowledge that I don't do this work on my own. I'm very fortunate to be mentored by a range of experts across public health, psychology and criminology. Now, I guess we all know that adverse experiences during childhood have impacts in terms of early development and interrupted early development, and also later physical and mental health problems. And we know that these impacts often occur through these complex processes of biological, psychological and social factors. But there is a growing recognition now, as Susan highlighted so much in her presentation, around the idea of these experiences tending to cluster. It's not often that a young person who experiences adversity experiences one type alone. They're often experiencing multiple types of adversity. And this has led to a growing body of work on the impact of accumulated early adversity rather than any single characteristic. And, you know, in this area, criminology, psychology, we've been studying these impacts, these consequences for decades. But I suppose more recently, this study published by some medical doctors in the US, 1998, really brought this idea of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, to the forefront of social policy and public health decision making. And so these doctors identified 10 distinct life events that can occur before age 18 that were shown to be associated with later health and mental health wellbeing outcomes in adulthood. And so they grouped them, I guess you can group them in sort of adversities that occur around child maltreatment, physical, sexual, emotional abuse and neglect, and adversity that occurs as a result of household dysfunction, so being exposed to a parent who has mental illness, substance use, incarceration. And we've now seen a proliferation of these types of studies focusing on ACEs in the youth justice space in particular, and in particular showing the high prevalence of these ACEs among young people in custodial facilities. And so this body of research, I guess, has largely focused on custody and has, I guess, ignored the large proportion of young people who are supervised by youth justice in the community. And also a lot of this research is heavily US-based. Susan said 3 studies on crossover children in Australia. Pretty much at the time of conducting this research, 0 research on that adverse childhood experiences spectrum in the Australian context. So really important to do that because we know that our context does differ in particularly to some parts of the US. We are driven by more welfare approaches to responding to young people who commit crimes. We also have quite a strong focus on diversion in South Australia, multiple opportunities to divert young people from the justice system. And of course, we can't ignore the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people, both in child protection and youth justice, the lasting legacies of colonisation, intergenerational trauma and systemic racism that leads to that overrepresentation. And this research is coming at a time where we actually have quite a bit of local knowledge in South Australia about that intersection between child protection and youth justice. So I just wanted to show you very quickly, using our whole population linked administrative data, if we take all children born from 1991 to 1998 and follow them to age 18, see the vast majority of young people won't have contact with child protection or youth justice, 71%. 1 in 4, by the time they're 18, will have at least 1 notification to child protection. So that's a shocking statistic of itself. And then this small green and blue circle, the 1.6% of young people who have child protection and youth justice system involvement, and the 0.3% of young people who have youth justice supervision only. So this is really highlighting that that pathway from child protection to youth justice is not deterministic. Most young people who have contact with child protection will not come under youth justice supervision. However, we take the alternative perspective. We look at all young people supervised by youth justice, and we see that 84% of those young people have had contact with child protection. So from a youth justice service planning perspective, really important for us to know, but also in terms of the research and understanding these developmental pathways and what's underlying or responsible for increasing risk for those known to child protection and leading to that overrepresentation in youth justice is really important for us to understand from that prevention and early investment perspective. And this research is coming at a time where we know, especially recently, it's all over the news, youth justice are really in a place where they're being pressured to manage these trauma-related developmental needs of young people that they're supervising. But when we conducted this research, we felt that there's quite a few questions that are still left unanswered. So we want to know, is there actually a difference between experiencing adversity, so all of these ACEs, and being traumatised in the clinical sense of trauma? And how are these experiences then associated with offending behaviour? Because we know most children who experience adversity aren't necessarily traumatised, and most children who are traumatised don't end up in the youth justice system. So how can we better understand these associations? Are there other key risk factors or protective factors that might be influencing these associations? So like any good researchers, we start this program of work with a systematic review, 124 studies. Our pooled data indicated that 87% of justice-involved young people across 13 countries experienced at least one ACE. The odds of experiencing at least one ACE were 12 times higher for these young people, but minimal evidence to suggest that a higher prevalence of ACEs was associated or predicted trauma symptoms or offending behaviour. So we concluded it was unclear whether ACEs and trauma are drivers of offending behaviour or coinciding vulnerabilities in high-risk populations. Now, we concluded this not because there's not necessarily that link, but because the quality of the studies, the methodological features of the studies, the evidence just isn't there to support that claim from that causal perspective. So that's why this research became really important. It is still a cross-sectional study. It still can't tell us anything about the causal mechanisms, but it gives us an idea of that difference between adversity and trauma and other risk factors for offending behaviour. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors on this report who, again, without them, this work wouldn't have been possible. And a shout out to Louisa Hackett, who's the principal psychologist at Youth Justice, who is here with us today, who really facilitated this work that required a lot of buy-in from both staff working in Youth Justice to facilitate the research and, of course, young people to participate. So we had a couple of objectives. First, to simply just describe the characteristics and experiences of ACEs among young people under youth justice supervision, then to measure trauma, substance use, social and emotional needs, and then to see if we could identify different groups of young people based on their experience of ACEs. It was a self-report assessment questionnaire, which we conducted over 2019 and into 2020 before COVID rudely interrupted, which had me actually based in youth justice offices and at our custodial facility in South Australia. We asked for consent to link the survey responses to administrative records from child protection and youth justice. Of course, ethics approval, which was a very lengthy ordeal, and we had really great oversight from youth justice advisors and cultural advisors working in the policy and practice area. This is my favourite slide of the whole presentation. We approached 211 young people, 184 participated, which meant we had a refusal rate of 13%. And so I love feeding this back to ethics, to researchers, to practitioners to say, yes, young people are very willing to spend the time to engage in research of this nature, and I'm very grateful to those 184 young people who sat with me for at least an hour to talk about their experiences. So of those who participated, we interviewed half in the community and half in Kalana Tapa, our custodial facility. As expected, vast majority were male. 62% identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and the median age was 16. So highly representative of the youth justice population in South Australia. A couple of different measures, which I won't go through today, but you can read about in the report, and a 3-stage analysis plan, the first being very descriptive, the second some fancier stats, which I'll go through, and then some comparative work. So I'm going to show you lots of graphs now, and the slides are going to look very busy, but I'm going to walk you through the results. 83% of young people, you take that life course perspective, had experienced at least one night in custody, and 57% had committed a violent crime. 94% were known to child protection, so that's even higher than what I reported with the linked administrative data, remembering that we now have self-report and administrative data for this work. 83% subject to a notification, 57% subject of an investigation, 46% of a substantiation for child abuse and neglect, and 1 in 3 experienced an out-of-home care placement. So now you're looking at the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences by sex, so young men in the dark blue, young women in the light blue, and everyone in the red. And if we just look at the maltreatment, you can see the prevalence of those experiences is, quite frankly, astounding. We're talking about 2/3 to 3/4, nearly all of young people experiencing reporting experiencing maltreatment. Even if you look at sexual abuse, the second lot of bars, the lowest prevalence, it's still 1 in 3 young women and 1 in 3 young women and 1 in 10 young men. Couple of differences between young men and young women, more similarities and differences, but one of the differences was family violence exposure. You can see young women more likely to report family violence exposure and more likely to report having a household member with a mental illness. And we also recognise that the adverse childhood experiences scale is quite limited in some of the things that they are, so we added a few other potential adverse experiences like the death of a close friend or family member, neighbourhood violence exposure and bullying, and you can see again 2/3 to 3/4 of the sample reporting these experiences. Fewer than 5 young people reported 0 ACEs, 88% reported 4 or more, and we also asked about frequency. So of the young people who had at least 1 ACE, you can see half to 2/3 reported experiencing those maltreatment types and family violence often or very often. And overall, 92% experience at least one of these ACEs frequently. So they're not one-off experiences. It's something that they're growing up with over their life course. Unsurprisingly, the prevalence of ACEs is really high in the youth justice population, but these estimates are actually up to 4 times higher than those reported in the international literature, which again validates the reason why we need to do local research and the importance of that. And clearly the need to better understand the impact of these life events on development and justice system involvement. Trauma. Anxiety, depression and anger, prevalent in half to 2/3 of the sample. Post-traumatic stress, dissociation, in particular overt dissociation in 2/3 of the sample. And then even symptoms of sexual distress, the lowest prevalence, we're talking about 1 in 5 young women and 1 in 10 young men reporting symptoms of sexual distress. 88% overall scored in the symptomatic range for at least one of these trauma symptom scales. And here are some of the critical items included in that measure. We're talking 1 in 3 young people reporting they're wanting to hurt themselves, almost 60% reporting wanting to hurt others, and 80% reporting getting into fights. Trauma symptoms clearly very common, symptoms of overt dissociation in particular. And I guess this points to some of the literature that we're seeing emerging, in particularly from the US, about understanding the underlying reasons for some of these behaviours. So in terms of dissociation, symptoms like emotional numbing, which might appear as callousness, might be actually driven by these traumatic experiences, which has a really sort of important implication for practice in this area. And thinking about whether helping young people process trauma might help to reduce risk in terms of justice system contact and offending behaviour. Substance use, again, no surprise, 85% scoring in the problematic ranges. Some of the descriptive questions were really interesting, half reporting they're using because they felt stressed, tense, full of worries or problems. 80% majority reporting using at night, but half also reporting using in the morning and when they first wake up, and a third getting up during the night to use, so an indication of the severity of that substance use. 70% reported using with others, but we also had almost half reporting using alone. And interestingly, 70% reporting they had no problems or were in control, but half also reporting that their family or friends had advised them to seek help. Overwhelming majority of young people in youth justice reporting substance use patterns indicative of clinical level disorders. But the prevalence is 9 times higher in this group than it is in when we look at population norms. And interventions that focus on the causes of substance use might be helpful alongside some of the more common behavioural approaches that we see in this area. Very quickly, emotional and behavioural problems, again, very prevalent, 2/3 internalising problems and almost all externalising problems. What's interesting about this is there is some evidence that these problems are more pronounced than what they were a decade ago. So we have practitioners telling us all the time, those who have been there for a long time, young people seem more complex. They seem to have, different sort of needs than what they did 20 years ago. Well, we're seeing some of that in these data, which, again, importance of doing this research, keeping it current. We need to better understand, how these things change over time so we can adapt our responses to and not just do the same thing that we were doing 10 years ago because we thought that worked. Fancy stats, what's laid in class? Model-based cluster analysis. We're trying to identify different subgroups of young people who share similar characteristics. So in this case, adverse childhood experiences. We tested a couple of different models, calculating posterior probability of membership in each class for each individual, and we chose a 4-class model based on face validity checks and fit statistics. What am I talking about? This is what that looks like. You can see 4 distinct groups represented by the colours. So I'll take you through them. You're looking at the probability of being in that group on the y-axis and the different ACEs on the x-axis. So if we take the gold line, you can see we call that the high on all adversities group. So the probability of having each ACE was high in every case. Then the dark blue group, we called the high maltreatment, high household dysfunction group. So it only differed from the high on all adversities group by that low prevalence of sexual abuse. Then the high maltreatment, low household dysfunction group in the red, again, only really differed by that low prevalence of sexual abuse and some lower prevalences of those household dysfunction variables. And then finally, the light blue group, which was the family or neighbourhood disadvantage group. You can see the prevalence of child maltreatment is low in that group, apart from neglect, which was still quite high, parental separation, having a family member or friend who died, witnessing neighbourhood violence, bullying. These are the proportions of young people that fell into every group, and you can see 3/4 of young people fell into a group with high maltreatment. So, again, not surprising given the prevalence of the reporting, but we're talking about pretty much all of them experiencing high levels of maltreatment. So let's then look at the comparisons if we take these groups, because we think, maybe there's a differential response. Do they look any different on other characteristics? So if we just look at some background characteristics, if we look, the only real difference we see is females being sort of the proportion of females in the high on all adversities group being a bit higher, which that was the group that had the high probability of sexual abuse, high prevalence of sexual abuse reported by females. It makes sense. But then in terms of the other variables, the violent offending custody, very similar, bit more child protection involvement for those in the maltreatment groups again. Trauma symptoms, can't go through all of them, I'll just go through any. Again, high on all adversities, high maltreatment, high household dysfunction, quite high. But really, when you look at the lowest one, the family neighbourhood disadvantage in the blue, 60% of young people had at least one trauma symptom in that group. Substance use and behavioural problems, again, we see very similar patterns where it's slightly higher among the high on all adversity group, but really not a huge amount of difference between all 4 groups. And this was really interesting. So we were able to follow these young people for 12 months after they participated in the survey to look at, did they have any new convictions, any new youth justice orders? What's horrifying is, yes, most of them come back, so 50 to 60% are back within a year. but the differences between the groups are very, very minimal. So yes, we can identify these distinct groups based on their patterns of adverse childhood experiences, but they all had really similar levels of trauma symptoms, substance use, behavioural problems, and reoffending. So more holistic approaches, psychological and social, to assessment and treatment may be more beneficial. So lots of implications from a whole system perspective for policy and practice. Thank you. In terms of prevention and early investment, I think no one would disagree that if we try to prevent adverse childhood experiences from happening, that maybe we can disrupt these pathways. But early investment and prevention doesn't have to be just in early childhood. Youth justice can play a role in that in terms of not re-traumatising young people, no re-victimisation, and of course that pathway from youth justice to adult corrections, we can work on preventing that too. The biggest criticism of ACE's research, and I am probably its biggest critic, is that there is absolutely no point in screening unless that's then linked to assessment, and of course, and that's then linked to referrals to services that we know are effective in addressing those symptoms. So in the absence of those, this is a very interesting study, it highlights prevalence, yes, but there's no point in doing it if we're not then going to refer on. Clear indication for the need for clinical level intervention as well, the role of psychology and other allied health disciplines in terms of addressing trauma symptoms in particular, but also thinking about some of the barriers and challenges in this area in youth justice and the really short mandates that we see, and then the opportunities to engage in these sort of really intensive long-term therapeutic approaches, and the need for that multidisciplinary, multi-agency collaboration to really be able to facilitate that engagement and that investment in reducing these symptoms. And then, of course, the characteristics of youth justice itself, thinking about, how we set up our custodial environments. I know we don't want to invest in more prisons and we don't want to invest in these custodial facilities. Far better off investing in prevention, but the reality is we have young people who are there at the moment, so what can we do to ensure that we're not re-traumatising them? And thinking about how staff are key assets and, the role of workforce development in this area to ensure that, young people have role models within those environments for, emotion regulation and things like that. So we clearly need greater investment in prevention and early investment. We need to better understand which diversion initiatives work when and for whom, which is the importance of looking at the broader spectrum of justice system involvement, like Susie has looked at with the court data, and also better understanding the needs of the youth justice population to inform our case planning, that workforce development strategies, etc. And really, I do think staff are key assets in this area. So how can youth justice staff promote pro-social behaviours? Takeaway, we now have the empirical evidence to wave in front of all of those decision makers, all of those politicians to say, this is a real issue. You can't ignore this. We need to do something different. We need to do things better. We need to investigate new ways of working with justice-involved young people that takes these experiences into account. And evidence-informed practice is key to making a difference in these young people's lives. Very happy to take questions.